So we're going to jump in here, and in this session, we're just going to really, talk about the relationship between the emotions that play out and the thoughts that occur in the mind, and how important it is to be able to make the distinction between emotion that we're feeling and the thoughts that we're thinking as separate and not necessarily inclusive of one another, meaning the emotion that we feel isn't necessarily true or real relative to the thoughts that we're thinking, and vice versa. The thoughts that we're thinking isn't necessarily there because of how we feel, but what we want to do is we want to start to make a distinction between the emotions that we're experiencing as not as who we are, and the thoughts that the mind thinks as though it's not who we are. And the reason this is so very important is because if we understand that the emotions that we're feeling and the thoughts that the mind is thinking isn't who we are as a person, and those emotions that we feel and the thoughts that we're thinking isn't necessarily a byproduct of the circumstances of life, the things that are going on in our life, the result of what's happened recently, and so on, then that gives us a lot of leverage to basically change the emotions that we feel, dictate the emotions we're going to feel, as well as the thoughts that the mind is going to think. And why is this so important is because if you look at any outcome a person gets in their life, whether it's an outcome they really love or it's an outcome they really hate, if we really, dissect that, if you will, or we reverse engineer where did the outcome come from, you can always see that emotions, which were then reinforced or driving thoughts, and then those thoughts fueling the emotion, is inherently what created the not only experience of life we're having, but also the outcomes and the results that we get, whether we love those outcomes or we don't. And so when we talk about or we think about, when I'm looking at a situation and I'm interpreting it for myself, or I have a perspective about what's going on, that's going to do so much for the outcome that I get. So a couple of examples, if I'm, having a challenge with my business and I start getting caught in the theme of this isn't working, and then that drives me, all of a sudden that thought could literally destroy my business if I get lost in it. On the other hand, I could have the exact same circumstances going on within my business, and if I have the ability to think, man, there's a opportunity here. This is the process of growth. I'm going to find the answer and produce my result. Like, a different quality of thinking is going to produce a very different outcome relative to the exact same circumstance that may be going on. So many people in a relationship, they get caught in those thoughts. Man, what if the relationship's going to end soon? What if this relationship isn't for me? What if this relationship isn't meant to be? And then all of a sudden, that's the beginning of the end of the relationship. The end of the relationship might happen 2 years later, but a lot of times it was the onset of thinking like that that drove the end of the relationship. On the other hand, we could be in thoughts of appreciation and gratitude for our relationship, the relationship we're in, and how it is the relationship for us and the ways in which it works for us, and that'll produce a very different outcome of relationship, especially 6 months or a year or years down the road. And so it's so important to understand this relativity between the thoughts that we permit the mind to think, the emotions that we experience and feel, and not only the experience of life we have, but the outcomes and the results that we either get in our life or that we don't get in life, based on the quality of the thinking that goes on. And so it's very important to just really understand this relationship between emotion and thought, and we're going to kind of cover a variety of different themes over the next 12 sessions or so around what do specific thought strategies or themes mean as they are thinking in the mind relative to the emotions that we're feeling, relative to where we are, as well as the outcomes that we get, the results we can predict it will produce in our life. And so if we understand this relationship, we just want to really get this emotion loop here where we go, man, whatever emotion is there is going to dictate and determine a narrow range of thinking that's going to occur in the mind. And then that narrow range of thinking, or that theme that happens to be playing like a tape in the mind, is then going to reinforce like emotion, and then we just get caught in that loop, in that cycle, and it just sort of reinforces over and over and over again. Now, the big mistake people make is they relate to the emotions that they're experiencing and the thoughts that are occurring in the mind as who they are, as opposed to an experience they're having, emotion, or simply thoughts that are occurring in the mind, but understanding that the mind is separate from who they are, as opposed to identifying with those thoughts. And so if we're willing to stop relating to thoughts as though they're real and true, and we start relating to the thoughts as more a question, is this thought going to inherently create the experience I want to have? Is this thought going to produce the result that I want in my life? All of a sudden, we can wield tremendous power over the mind, and we can literally teach the mind to perform on our behalf, become the greatest ally we've ever known, as opposed to our greatest adversary. For most people, their emotions and their thoughts are getting in the way of the experience of life they want to have and the results they want to get. Day in and day out, they are fighting with their emotions in their mind. It's become their greatest adversary as opposed to their greatest ally. And the first step to making sure the emotions and the mind are your greatest ally is we got to understand how they work, and we got to see what's occurring as it's occurring. We've got to train a little bit of awareness. And so this isn't a chicken or egg conversation. It's not that thoughts are producing the emotions that we feel, but they do reinforce the emotion that's present. And let me explain that distinction. When we were children, first couple years of life, we felt a lot of emotion. Our whole nervous system was inside of emotional communication prior to language. We didn't start talking or even learning words until maybe, a year old or 2 years old or 3 years old. And even, 5, 6 years old, we started talking. We still didn't understand a lot of what we were saying, but man, had we been feeling a lot of emotions. There was an emotional communication going on. There was an emotional relationship occurring. We may not have known to call the emotions that we were feeling sadness or anger or joy or appreciation or gratitude, but it doesn't mean that we weren't having those experiences of ourselves, learning that language from our environment. And also just inherently our nervous system has been doing it for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And then later thought got superimposed on top of those emotions, and then we started to rationalize our emotions and feelings. And so if we understand how to break this down, we can kind of attack it from the emotion or the mind in terms of understanding and training awareness and a greater sensitivity to where we are at any moment, and then that's going to relate to the ability to create in our life. And so we can, develop a sensitivity as we've done in previous sessions where we can go, hey, in this moment I feel sad, and that's totally okay, and just focus on the experience of sadness as an example. But we can also catch the theme of sadness being reinforced by the mind by way of looking at the subject matter that the mind is playing, and is that reinforcing the emotion? So as we've talked about in previous sessions around sadness, anytime sadness is present, the mind is focused on the absence of something. And so if we understand the themes of how the mind focuses on the absence of something, and we go, wow, you know what? I'm focused on how I don't have what I want in my life. I'm focused on the people who have left my life. I'm focused on what I used to have but I no longer have. And there are a variety of themes that are going to fuel and reinforce sadness. And so if we don't catch those themes playing in the mind, it's very common to get caught in a sadness loop, and that can define months or even decades of our life, worst case scenario. Whereas if we can start to catch the mind and go, okay, that's just the mind and that which it's been conditioned and trained to do, that doesn't have to, I don't have to identify it myself through that anymore. The mind isn't necessarily validating or verifying the circumstances of life. It actually has nothing to do with going on in my life right now. It's just where the mind is focused. And if we learn to catch the mind and understand what it's fueling and that which it's creating, we can put a stop to the thinking and redirect it so that the mind starts to produce the outcomes that we want to see happen in our life. And so I invite you to just have this emotion loop in your mind as we go through our sessions. And remember, emotion is going to drive the mind. It's going to tell it what to think. The mind reinforces the emotion by fueling, intensifying it by way of reinforcing whatever emotion happens to be there, and then it loops upon itself unless we develop the capacity, which we're going to show you how to do, to recognize that loop is playing out, put a stop to it, and then redirect not only the emotion but also the mind in playing the tapes and driving the experience of ourselves that's going to produce not only the experience of life we want to have, but also the outcomes and the results. And so look forward to seeing you in the next session, and we'll get started breaking this down.